Schreier. I'm the Vice President for Collections and Library Services here at the Newberry, and we'd like to welcome you to this public program, and we are really thrilled to be hosting it this evening as part of the Terra-funded Art Chicago initiative. So, as many of you know, the Newberry is now the home of the Curt Teich Postcard Archives collection, which we received 2 years ago as a gift from the Lake County Forest Preserve District. We were thrilled to accept this amazing collection because it is a perfect fit with several of the Newberry's core thematic collections, including maps, travel and tourism, local and family history, Chicago and the Midwest, and the history of printing. So it won't surprise you that a couple of months ago we made the postcard collection, or Postcards, our newest core collection, and it's not something we do at the drop of a hat. It has to be a really meaningful, sort of transformative change in the scale of our collecting in a particular area, and the gift from Lake County certainly represented that to us for Postcards. But Postcards really aren't a new collecting area for the Newberry. Like every library or other repository that collects family papers and various topics, you're always going to have postcards in family papers, and we value them as part of those collections. We had a few subject collections, especially in our maps and travel and tourism, but it's really the case that the addition of 2.5 million postcards all at one time is a whole different plateau level, and it did really make us see postcards in a new way and deal with them both administratively, organizationally, but also in thinking about research opportunities for our different audiences in very exciting new ways. Thanks to the wonderful work that had been done by the Lake County Discovery Museum under the leadership of Catherine Hamilton Smith, who is one of tonight's panelists, and the indefatigable efforts of several Newberry staff members and volunteers, and I've seen some of them in the audience tonight as well, we were able to open the collection to the public for research only a few months after it arrived. We're continuing to enhance the database that Lake County began, continue the digitization that they started, and process the wonderful production files, which are the 100,000 job files for the production of the 350,000 Teich images that are in the collection that reveal the client company back and forth over transforming the idea and perhaps an initial photograph into the finished product. They're just fascinating. And we developed a postcard collecting policy because we are and plan to continue adding to the collection selectively the more we come to know about it and see ways that we'd like to develop it, or see themes that are not as developed as we'd like them to be in the collection. Above all, we're committed to promoting use of the collection and a broad understanding of postcards as a unique medium with its own history, and as visual documentation for researchers studying 19th century cultural history and social history of about any topic you can imagine. So for that reason, we're thrilled to have you here this evening to learn a little bit about the collection and share ideas about the ways that postcards can be central as visual documentation. Some of you know that it's a very exciting time at the Newberry. We're in the very final stages of a total renovation of our first floor. You may have peeked outside or been tempted, I hope, by our new bookstore, and maybe have a little time to explore it on this visit or other visits. Most of all, we're really excited about a new welcome center, which we hope will help people coming to the library for the first time to find out the collections we hold, the courses, the adult education courses we offer, the public programs that they might be interested in, and just sort of demystify and create a more welcoming environment for everybody who steps inside the front door. We hoped to have a fairly extensive display of Teich postcards in the adjacent room, but unfortunately, and if you've ever done a renovation project, you will understand that it didn't quite get ready in time. So we're very grateful to Lisa Stone, who brought some items from her own collection that are on the back table, along with a few artifacts from the Teich collection. But we hope you enjoy the program, enjoy the postcards that are here for you to see, and most of all, come back to use and learn more about the collection for your own research or pleasure. So thank you very much. And by the way, if you haven't picked up one of these, you can't miss it if you know what you're looking at. It's a wonderful, just a guide, a quick guide to the various components of the collection and how to learn more about them online, where there's a lot of information.
Thanks, Alice. I'm Liesl Olson. I'm Director of Chicago Studies here at the Newberry, and I get the special privilege of introducing our fabulous speakers for tonight. This program, again, is sponsored by the Terra Foundation for American Art, which, as many of you probably know, is sponsoring so many amazing exhibits and publications and programs around the city right now focused on the incredibly rich artistic legacy, right, our artistic culture and history of art as produced here in Chicago. So thank you to the Terra Foundation again. As part of this program is part of a three-part series of public programs that Terra is supporting here at the Newberry. So mark your calendars for Wednesday, October 24th, when we explore Collective Thought, Chicago Clubs and Their Patrons, 1880 to 1920. That's a program that looks at the proliferation of small arts organizations, clubs, both bohemian and genteel, that were forming around Chicago when Chicago was getting its own cultural footing in the early 20th century. It will hopefully be accompanied by a display of materials from our collection. We have a really rich series of collections of papers related to Chicago clubs. And our third public program will be called Chicago Style, Typography and the City, and that's on December 1st. It's a Saturday, and we'll explore the aesthetic and technological dimensions of typography and book design in Chicago. We're partnering with the Chicago Design Museum. So and they're going to help us do a hands-on creative workshop where we actually make holiday cards based upon some historic designs from our type specimens and typography collections here at the Newberry. There's also a flyer over here on the table that you can pick up about those other two programs. Now tonight we're focusing on postcards, their history, their connection to Chicago, and the ways in which scholars and artists and everyday people have used postcards, not just as a form of communication, but as a form of documentation and inspiration and archival discovery. So as you learned from Alice, the Newberry just acquired 2.5 million postcards from the Curt Teich Postcard Archive. So our speakers will be drawing largely from that collection. And I think what you'll find is that they're really coming at it from three very different angles. This collection is so vast, so extraordinary, that there's so many different ways that we can work with it. What we'll do is have each speaker present material for 10 or so minutes, and then we'll all sit up here and I'll pose some questions. We'll open it up for your comments and questions too, and we'll see what kind of ideas emerge. So Catherine Hamilton Smith is our first speaker. She probably knows more about the Curt Teich Postcard Archive than anybody else because she presided over it for many years, right? She is Director of Public Affairs and Development of the Lake County Forest Preserves. This is where the collection was held before it came to the Newberry. Hamilton Smith has held several positions within the district, most recently Director of Cultural Resources. Prior to joining the Lake County Forest Preserve, she was an assistant curator of the Epstein Photographic Archives at the University of Chicago. She is a member of the American Alliance of Museums and is certified with the Academy of Certified Archivists. Hamilton Smith received her bachelor's degree in art history from the University of Nebraska and attended St. Andrews University in Scotland, studying art and music history. She also holds a master's degree in art and music history from the University of Chicago. So Catherine will go first, and she'll be followed by Mike Jackson, who is a preservation architect in Springfield, Illinois. Thanks for coming up, Mike. He was the Deputy State Historic Preservation Officer in Illinois from 2009 to 2013 as part of a 31-year career in public service. He was a visiting professor of architecture at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign from 1993 to 2013. He's an active member of the Association for Preservation Technology and currently directs the Building Technology Heritage Library Project. He's been active in the field of historic preservation through his career and has been a leader in the areas of roadside architecture, Main Street, modern heritage, and sustainability. He started collecting postcards during his semester abroad program in 1970. So I'm sure you have a massive collection of your own too. And then Lisa Stone will be our third presenter. She's the curator of the Roger Brown Study Collection, an adjunct associate professor in the Department of Art History, Theory, and Criticism, both at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Her research and teaching concern the preservation and interpretation of artists' environments and collections, and the relationship of objects to creative practice. She has a Master of Science in Historic Preservation from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. She co-curated the exhibition Chicago Calling, Art Against the Flow, part of the Terra Foundation for American Art's Art Design Chicago initiative, and that's currently on view at Intuit, the Center for Intuitive and Outsider Art. So we're really happy to have them all here, and Catherine will hand it over to you. Thank you.
Good evening, and thank you so much. It's thrilling to see so many postcard lovers here tonight. Let's have a show of hands. Who loves postcards? Okay, see, we're in good company. Each of us have just a short amount of time, and I'm charged with the task of telling you just a little bit about the Curt Teich company here in Chicago, as well as giving you a sort of flavor for the panoply that is postcards in the late 19th and then 20th century. So I'm going to go through the images pretty quickly and then make sure that I can fit them all in my allotted 10 minutes. Postcards didn't emerge out of whole cloth in terms of the relationship between printed visual images and experience, and especially travel. They are related to an earlier sort of mid-19th century phenomenon of printed figurative envelopes. This is one of the ones that you see here. This is an envelope, not a postcard, that is from about 1870, so just in the years immediately following the Civil War. Similarly, this is a printed, this is English, this is from 1861, and it's a it's a printed illustrated letterhead. So this is also something that travelers would purchase when they were experiencing some vacation or holiday, the English would say. They would buy figurative letterhead like this and write a letter and post it home. Neither of these are postcards, but they do come out of the phenomenon in the mid-1800s of images related to, printed images specifically, not painted images related to travel. The very first picture postcards as we know them today that would have a printed image of something, generally of a location, and a space for your message, were those printed for the Paris Exposition in 1889. And specifically printed by the French newspaper Le Figaro to celebrate the completion of the Eiffel Tower, which at that time was the highest human-made structure on the face of the earth. And the only place you could purchase these postcards is if you ascended the tower, and from the top, you could purchase a postcard and you would post it from from the tower. So it was completely about phenomenon, about experience, and about the connection of those human experiences with sending a message, both visual and in writing, to someone else in a different spot. So this actually is not one of the original 1889 postcards, but it serves to show that important date, 1889. Well, let me go back and say, you notice that there's this big space on the right-hand side of this particular image, and that's because in the early couple of decades of postcards, you actually couldn't write your message on what's referred to by the post office as the front of the postcard, because it's the part of the it's the part of the postcard that would carry the address and the stamp. So in those early days, the postcards would have to allow you on the face of it, where the image of the place you were visiting appeared, a space for your message. And this would be the back of the same sort of postcard from that time period, where it would only include the address and the stamp. But Chicago has everything to do with the birthplace of the American picture postcard, because the very first American picture postcards, in exactly the same vein as those printed for the 1889 Paris Exposition, were printed for the World's Columbian Exposition here in Chicago. There are a set of 10 of them by Goldsmith, that was the publisher. And this is an important moment in postcard history, because these postcards were not intended to be sent in an envelope. They were exactly as I described them, a place for your message to whomever your addressee was, and on the other side, the address and the stamp. So Chicago is the birthplace of the American picture postcard. Even more reason that this collection is today at the Newberry Library. I'll give you just a little sketch of the background of the Curt Teich Company, which existed in Chicago from 1898 to 1978. The man you see here is Curt Teich Sr. His father came to Chicago for the Columbian Exposition and went back to Germany, to Lobenstein, Germany, and said to his sons, all of them, there's a lot to be had in Chicago and the United States, and I think you should go and do whatever it is you can find to do. The Teich family were printers in Lobenstein, so they had a several generations history of printing, and printing was very much in their blood. Curt Teich came here as a 19-year-old. This is him, pictured as 19 years old, coming to the United States, and his idea was to start a printing company. It didn't have anything to do with postcards in the very first years of the company. But he founded it here in Chicago, and in those first years it was a jobber printer. They printed everything from, you came in and you wanted your business cards printed. They printed German language newspapers. They printed anything that would come through the door. But very quickly he recognized the phenomenon of this picture postcard. It was brand new idea, and he jumped on it and began to form a niche for his company, and eventually became the world's largest volume printer of view and advertising postcards. They were printed here in Chicago. And they printed more by volume, just by literal volume, postcards than any other publisher in the world. This is a picture of the plant that still exists on Irving Park in Ravenswood, on the southeast side corner. It is still there. It is on the National Register of Historic Places, and it's now, I believe, condominiums. For a while it was apartments, and now I think it's purchased condominiums, the name of which is Postcard Place. And there is, if you visit there, I think in the vestibule in the library, you will find a little bit of historic information about it. And if you take the North Line train that goes up to Lake Forest, you will see as you pass this building the ghost sign that appears on the top that still says Curt Teich Picture Postcards. So it's still there on the building. This is a view of the first offset press, not in that Irving Park and Ravenswood building. It was in an earlier building. They were in 3 buildings total in the city of Chicago during the time they were in business. That is not Curt Teich there. It is a pressman, an unidentified pressman, but this shows an interesting early view of Heidelberg press. And you see on the back end the size of that sheet of paper. That's how the postcards were printed. Even later, and still today, to a certain extent, they're printed on big sheets and then cut. This was the Curt Teich stock in trade, was views of towns and cities. There is a story that bit of a fish story, but his family tells it, that he left Chicago when he conceived of the idea of specializing in postcards. He left Chicago on a train headed southeast to Florida and started all the way in Florida and followed the train line. Every time the train would stop, he would get off, not for just minutes, but would stay in the town for a day or two and take views up Main Street and down Main Street and the new bandstand and the new Carnegie Library and whatever seemed important to the town. And then he would go to local retailers and try and interest them in this idea of views of their town. And came back, this is where the fish story comes in, came back to Chicago with $30,000 worth of orders and was in business and realized that there was a market for views of American towns and cities. And think for a moment, if you will, that this is right at the beginning of the 20th century. So this is the moment when American towns and cities are emerging now 30 years after the end of the Civil War, and they are changing at an unprecedented pace. And so to have the coupling of the phenomenon of picture postcards happening at the very same time that America is changing and burgeoning at this rate was a very special alignment of the planets, if you will, that it just happened that the phenomenon of picture postcards and taking pictures of everyday places happened at a time when those places were developing and changing. This is one of my favorite Curt Teich postcards because it is so average. And that is a very important point, because if the average views of the average places of these American small towns and cities, this one happens to be in Pullman, but it could be anywhere. It could be in Kearney, Nebraska, which is where I was born. It could be, you name it, USA. But if at this time, when these places were brand spanking new, and those beautiful marble counters where you would write out your check were all polished and fresh and people were proud of them, that view might not have existed otherwise, and it certainly wouldn't exist down to us today because it's not special in any way, but it is a form of boosterism of place as place changed in the 20th century. So the unspecialness of picture postcards in these early decades is what makes them so special in my mind. Alice referred in her opening remarks to the art files. There are slightly over 100,000 of them, and I'm just going to show you the images from one of those files. This is the finished postcard for Kirk's Better Food in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. I know we've all been there, or a place like it. And this is the finished postcard. What we also have in those art files, in some cases, are the original photographs that would have been taken of Kirk's, sent back to Chicago to the plant, so that the artists at the Chicago plant would be able to begin to design the postcard. So this is the photograph. I want you to observe a little bit about it and the people eating there. And this is the back of the same thing. You notice the note right at the bottom. It says, "Remove farmer at door." There he is. And lo and behold, he is not there. So that is something you need to know. Now, when my colleague Mike Jackson talks in just a minute, he's going to show you real photo postcards of American Place, also very important. But the changes in these images have to do with how business owners wished the community to perceive them. And that is an important ingredient in postcard history in and of itself. So there's real photo postcards Mike will talk about, and then these printed cards. Just a few other things. This is the artist's sketch. This is just a hand-drawn sketch that would have been sent back to Sioux Falls, South Dakota to get approved. Remember, the photograph is black and white, so we need to understand color. And so in order to understand it, they would also send little bits of whatever it is, upholstery, wallpaper in this case. You see there, let's go back quickly to, oops, there it is. So there's no wallpaper on that wall. We can only think that they're about ready to revamp the place, but in the file and on the postcard, there's an actual piece of that wallpaper. Carpet, fabric, trim, wood, upholstery, those little remnants are in these art files so that you have not only the original photograph, but the finished appearance of what the business owner wished and all the ingredients that went into accomplishing that. It's really remarkable that all of that remained remains to us today. So a quick sketch of all the remarkable things you'll find on postcards. This is just to give you an overarching view of what I know you all love anyway. But the Teich company was one of the most important one of the most prolific companies in terms of producing these large letter postcards, which are such a big part of American culture. It's an iconic image, really. In fact, I just was watching Next Week with John Oliver, the Sunday. Does anyone watch that? Well, the Sunday one he was doing a little sketch on Florida, and sure enough, there was a Curt Teich postcard, Florida, land of sunshine. I thought, see? Why? Because it's iconic. And people understand postcards immediately. They just understand them. Just a few examples of the wonders that are in the Teich Archives collection. This is a 1939 roadside image, the cool it's one of my favorites. Pumpkin Pie Day in Longmont, Colorado. This is part of a sort of an idea of community boosterism around postcards. This still exists, by the way. They still do Pumpkin Pie Day in Longmont, Colorado. This is the destruction of liquor at the time of Prohibition in front of the courthouse in Independence, Kansas. This is also a Teich postcard, and this is one example. I've only brought one, I believe, this evening, of postcards documenting something specific that happened. So tragedies, the destruction of a bridge by a tornado, those sorts of things. And very disturbing images as well. Lynchings. The most disturbing sorts of images are captured on postcards as well. Boy, we go from that to that. I don't know. I just think that alone gives you the whole universe of postcards. But this is from the 1960s and also a Teich card, but expressive of how we've just come through Longmont, Colorado, and now we've arrived here a couple of decades later. Postcards, all of them 3.5 by 5.5 inches, and on them is expressed all the cultural currents of the 20th century. That's an important thing to know about them, I think, and one of the reasons for their importance is not only the iconic large letter type cards, but also that on them, in this one standard size, you can find everything that happened in the 20th century in terms of its look, its feel, and the actual experience itself. 1906 Chicago Cubs. There is a companion card to this. It's the Sox. I just didn't have time to show it. Bozo's Circus, had to throw this in because it's a Chicago crowd. These are all in the Curt Teich collection. And then this goes from, again, this kind of a juxtaposition there from Bozo's Circus to this, which is printed in the early 1920s for the KKK. And I have others in my more extended lecture on postcards. I have others that show segregated locations and some even mildly disturbing images, not even ranging into the very, very disturbing images. But one of the important things about the Teich company is that they printed whatever came through their doors. And so it is what I call an uncurated collection, because there was nobody saying, oh, well, I like that, and I like that, and I like that. If the job came in the door, they printed it. And so it is America curating itself in a sense. And that's one of the reasons why the Teich Archives is so important, that this industrial collection was saved over all these years, and it's how America saw itself in the 20th century. A quick bow to the real photo portrait cards. These two are real photo postcards, both portraits. A very important aspect of postcard history is that itinerant photographers would go around this country and stay in a town for 2 or 3 days or a week or a couple of weeks, and people of modest means could come and have a formal portrait done. And on the left-hand side, that is my father, who's about to ship out to the World War II, and on the right-hand side is my great-grandfather, his grandfather, both on real photo postcards. And then just to end my comments, these are now what I'm venturing into non-Teich images, but just to give you a sense of the types of things that you will find on postcards. This is 2 political postcards I brought tonight. This one of Tony Blair, and this one printed. Now this was printed, this is a postcard, and this was printed in 2015. So need I say more? I brought just what else exists outside of the Teich production, the production of the Teich company, but within the Newberry's collection are the collections of some systematic collectors. The person you see here is Leonard Lauder. He is the chairman emeritus of the Estee Lauder companies. He is a collector, a very high-end collector of mostly 20th century, late 19th and 20th century art. You see behind him a Picasso, one of the Cubist collection that he recently gave to the Metropolitan Museum in New York. But he also collects postcards, and I think we're going to talk about that in a little bit. And one of his collections is here in the Newberry collection. He started collecting postcards when he visited in the summer or in the winter down in Miami. And now he collects Wiener Werkstatt postcards, and he collects Japanese art postcards. And what is here at the Newberry is from an English company called Raphael Tuck, a publisher of art postcards called Oilets. And that's what is here at the Newberry Library. In the collection, we also have woven in silk postcards. What you see here is like a mat, and then inside the mat is a woven postcard of, in this case, the Titanic, that's woven on a jacquard loom. The work of the Czechoslovakian, the Czech artist Alfons Mucha. This is the collection of another collector within the Newberry's collection called the Brian Bozier collection. He collected early road building. He collected postcards of the suffragette movement. He collected Santas. And then we have a beautiful and comprehensive collection of postcards related to the Century of Progress here in Chicago, put together by Grant Schmalgemeyer, who is another postcard collector. The rich juvenile collection of amusement park postcards is here within the Teich archives. And then John Monroe, who's an active collector, still contributing to the collection here at the Newberry. One of the collections he gave us is from the Detroit Publishing Company. This is an early view of the western United States, Colorado. And then in that collection also are these wonderful images of Native American portraits. Route 66, I'm going over my time, so I'm going to go quickly over Route 66. And then I have 5 images right here at the end. And one is expressive of how constant the use of postcards is. This is just a plain old, millions of them are sold in Paris every year, picture postcard of the Eiffel Tower. This is the back of a much earlier postcard of the Eiffel Tower sent in 1907, where it says, "Yesterday it was a beautiful day in Paris and we had a good time and we went to the top of the Eiffel Tower," 1907. And then this one from 1999 that has really almost the exact same message. Here I am at the top of the Eiffel Tower. And remember all the way back to the beginning of my remarks that the first picture postcards as we know them came from the 1889 World Exposition in Paris. But from that day to this, over 100 years, and I was just in New York 2 weeks ago and I sent postcards from New York. And I did it in the exact same way. Why? Because I'm in a great place and I love people some other place, and I bought a stamp and I picked that image. I picked the image that I wanted to send and I sent it. And in that experience is place, selection of image, experience, the action of the posting of it, that it's carried through the mail, and that has not changed from 1889 to 2018. And just so you know that everyone sends postcards, this one was sent to Guillaume Apollinaire, the artist and critic from Pablo Picasso. This one in 1907. And this one also from Picasso to Apollinaire 10 years after that. And don't you see how his artistic imagery has changed? So everyone sends postcards. You do, I did 2 weeks ago, and we all will again. And thank you very much.
Thank you. Happy to be here. Suffering a little bit of a cold, but I'll get through this. That's a tough act to follow, but Catherine and I have been following each other for a long time, so anyway, my name is Mike Jackson, and I'm going to confess that I am a postcard collector, but I use these in the purpose of preservation. So I'm going to give you a little insight into what I did, what I collected, and how these things worked, and what I learned about postcards. So here we are, starting with Chicago, Illinois. I got my start in preservation in Galena on Main Street, and it's a topic that you heard the Curt Teich brothers developed in their first marketing. It's an image that's often captured because it captures that sense of place and community. I grew up with this as my community. I did a preservation thesis on Main Street, Galena in 1972, so I was in on the beginning of the Main Street movement. I collected Main Street postcards. You find them from all over the country, from north, south, east, and west, because it was the image of place that's going to tell you about that vernacular community. It's one of the best. And if you are in the preservation business, one of the things we do is create preservation guidelines, sense of how to work with the past. Inevitably, you will see picture postcards used as part of the image base to set the story, because those early preservationists saw the postcard as this animated sense of place with all the things in there, and it gets integrated into these documents. And Main Street was documented not just from the architecture and the static. Special events happened. Sometimes a special event's a disaster, tornadoes, floods, those things get picked up. But celebrations, and this one on the right, the Knights Templar, in inspiration, I once designed a series of columns like this for Flatbush Avenue in Brooklyn after I'd purchased this postcard. They didn't build it, but I did design it based upon the inspiration from the postcard. Postcards could capture the night as well as the day. And I'm kind of intrigued by these various people that used early lighting, and I like these arches over the street or things that make lighting more celebratory and more atmospheric in the way we created a downtown atmosphere. So these are kind of unusual images because you don't see a lot of nighttime views. And even capturing signage. The one on the left is an early 1915-ish era of lighted, and then the neon era of the city. The lighting's a little off here, at least for me in this view, but that neon jungle of the city at night, that's a mid-50s image, which really captures how much the streetscape changed with the signs. The buildings might stay the same, but the businesses change, the signs change, and there was in and out. And I have to confess, when I started in the preservation business in 1973, I once told someone to take a neon sign down, and I'm sorry about that. You know, it's like, I got over it, we moved on, but, you know. I like the images that convey the sense of activity and people in place. You know, pedestrians are the sign of a busy historic district, a busy place, lots of people. And these are a couple of interesting images that show how much you capture that spontaneous sense of people in tourist attractions, in particular, Florida town in the winter and Venice, California. But then in the 20th century, we did have to live up to the automobiles as part of place, and they had their place on Main Street. But a tip for you if you want to be in the documentation business is find a geek auto friend, because dating things with the dates of cars, those car guys can do that. You know, they're mostly guys, but they can tell you whether it's a 32 or a 34 Ford and help you get that date straightened out and tightened on the image in the postcard when you've got good cars in the view. But here's the main thing I want to do as a takeaway on the postcard. Catherine touched upon it. But there was a unique American postcard type that spread across the world, and it's the real photo postcard. In the eBay world, the RPPC, the real photo postcard. Born in 1902, when Kodak started producing 3.5 by 5.5 printing film plates so that you could print from the film directly onto a postcard back. This really takes off after 1906 when the laws changed about the address. And I would say the period from 1910 to 1920, 30 is the peak era of the picture postcard, the photo postcard, but it doesn't go away until the 1970s and color takes over. But these itinerant photographers, just about any rural photo studio would have the ability to produce a postcard. So these Wild West villages here, dirt roads, a few buildings, had themselves captured on postcards. If you can read the lettering, sometimes they would scratch the name on the back of the negative, and so they had to write in reverse letters. So oftentimes they kind of the lettering gets a little screwed up sometimes because the S's get backwards because they're trying to write backwards on these things. So that's how simple and primitive, but these documents capture, and I'm not the inventor of this phrase, but I think they were the predecessor to the Instagram. Every town could get this, you could have it done, it's ready for you, and then you send it off. And I particularly love these building pictures. And there's a particularly wonderful phenomena of people wanting to have their picture of their building with them in front of it. There's a, here's the guy standing in front of the bank building, and unfortunately it is guys in front of buildings mostly, at this point anyway. But I've collected these from all around the country, standing in front, here they are, their place, their store, their bank, whatever it is, small. These capture place in the essence of the structure. And it wasn't just the exteriors of the buildings. These were also used for interiors. This is a wonderful fold-out panorama picture. So it's two photographs or postcards that fold together, open up to make the full interior view of this innovation, which was kind of a soda fountain in downtown Carmi, Illinois. And it has good identification to it. This continues a trend that you see throughout this, the inside images and real photos. And here you can see kind of the generations of the drugstore. And if you look on the left, the early store, everything's under the casework. You had to talk to the clerk to get it out. That guy named Montgomery Ward and George Woolworth were the two guys who really championed the 5 and dime and opened up the counters for everybody. So modern retailing is in the story here as we move to open counters, but the jewelry store still maintained the closed counters. Saloon photographs. They're quite popular. They're among the more valuable ones. Again, more ways to find men standing around in animation, right? You give them an excuse, something to put in their hand, and look what they'll do. So anyway, another subset of my collection is the interior views of people. But it's not just commercial space, it's not just the street and the roadside, it also extends to the residential areas. Homeowners would commission this photographer to come and take a picture of their house, their street. So all of these multiple places get documented by this itinerant crowd of photographers and local photo studios through the Real Photo Postcard. And they're often the humble places, but they connect to the whole landscape, the setting of this place. Sometimes there's people in there, but not always. Sometimes you get horses and buggies and things, but they would capture it at a moment in the time. And if it's postmarked, you have a better sense of the date. Many of these are undated. Industry was there. So again, if you're seeing this as a comprehensive way for documenting vernacular space, commercial, residential, industrial, all these people are using the Real Photo photographer and this medium to tell their story, to document their place. Now, the postcard on the road as a travel photography document is an incredibly important part of the story. This is one of those, this is a single postcard, a rare panorama photograph, big long thing. It's about 8 inches long, I think. No, let's see, 5 inches, it's about 11 inches long, so yeah. And so it's double the size of a typical photograph, capturing a rural route, a highway through this place. It's the Great Smokies. So it's part of that travel photography thing. And I have a whole nother lecture on gas, food, and lodging, which is the history of architecture along the roadside. That's another hat that Catherine and I wore back in the 80s when we were active with the Society for Commercial Archaeology. That's the roadside architecture people, still around, SCA. So we got into using this. This was part of one of the areas of collecting that I really emphasized at the time. So I'm on Main Street, I'm on the Route 66, I'm on the road, and again, I'm collecting these documents of place. And I like the gas, food, and lodging ones. And here I can tell you that is a 1959 Chevy, because we had one just like that. I remember that, those tail fins like that. Back when tail fins were really important to your identity every year. So these things show up, and these were often produced and provided for free by the businesses. So sometimes it was sold, sometimes it provided for free, but individual businesses, and they would be produced en masse. In the early days, they're individual one-of-a-kind images, and you don't get the repeating thing. So these would be produced and sold. Route 66 is a popular theme. The James Powell collection is there at the Curt Teich. He was an early aficionado of Route 66 who collected postcards. He gave his collection to the Teich collection. It's here. Here's a couple of views from Route 66. I particularly enjoy this one on the left, the Motorant. It didn't seem to catch on. Motel, yes. Motel 1. Motorant, no, just didn't make it. But if you look up here, it did have Fred at the organ up there. So, you know, this place has a wannabe Liberace there, you know, ready to entertain you when you get to the Motorant. So, you know, there's language stories in here as well as architecture. And of course, the colossal roadside attractions. What more touristy thing can there be than be behind some big thing that's made to be a giant object in the world? And this is a universal thing. It's not only America. We all did these things. I just finished a Bill Bryson book about Australia, and he talks about going to see the giant lobster. So, you know, it's not just America. This idea has caught on across the world. Now, I'm not immune to the idea that there are people in pictures, and, you know, besides the men standing in front of buildings. And this is kind of where I want to finish up about and talk about is on the Real Photo Postcard, this was the everyday image. This was so universally available, it got used a lot. And it was take your baby into the baby studio, get the baby picture taken. I love the idea of the Shell Beach Embroidery Club documenting their event in Corpus Christi, and they put the date and everything on there. And that, you know, you got time and place and person and age and all of this information, and this is the best kind of documents to find, although why I found them and they're not in some family collection, that's a different part of the story. But there's a fun part to this to me, and it's the detective work of getting a place or an image and then trying to go, okay, what information can I get from that? These real photographs are high quality, crisp, and we were able to blow this up and discover that it said Hillingdale Ranch on there, on the side of that wagon. So that little 3x5 image, and you're talking maybe 1 inch of image right down here, had enough information on it that we could locate where this picture was taken from. And not necessarily exact time, but date from that. You can work from postmarks, you can work from the signs and clothes and fashion and cars and other things to date to try and get some content. But the reason that becomes an issue is that many of these images survive with no information on them. You have an image, a story that goes behind it, but it's left to us to the future with no data. So this is a call to a challenge, the future. How are we going to work with all this unknown information? And for those of you who are photographing away with our phones, have you labeled them all? Have you thought about that? What about those family photo albums and your 91-year-old mother-in-law? Have you got her to put the names and dates on everything? So before we produce even more generations of missing information, think about that. We've got the past generation. Are we creating more generations of documents without data? Because I would say of my 1,000+ real photo postcards, I have another 500 unidentified that I bought because they were great images, but I have no data to connect to them, and I'm kind of curious about that. So that's kind of my call to arms on the real photo postcards, the vernacular, early story, Instagram, but one that has some missing links in it. Thank you.
Two really great, whoops, oh, it already happened. Great presentations to follow. Thank you both, and a blanket thank you to everyone here at the Newberry Library for gathering the postcard lovers of Chicago together. And I'll explain this later, but I just could not resist calling my little 10-minute talk Outline of a Vision. So in 1989, I discovered the Curt Teich postcard collection at Lake County Museum, and I think it was fairly young then, correct? Or 80, okay, so I was not right on top of it. But at any rate, I took the trip to Lake County Museum, and Catherine showed me around what was then a darling little house with this absolutely phenomenal collection that I could not begin to get my head around, and I still haven't, although I've gotten somewhere with it. And I began pestering the staff over and over with requests for lists and lists and lists of postcards. Granted, I was doing research in these areas, but I just wanted to see everything. And I think they finally decided to put me to work and say, we're just going to request all these images. Maybe she'd write a few essays for their image file magazine. So I did, which was a great opportunity. And I just did two, and the two articles that I wrote used real photo postcards, or they were about sites that were illustrated with real photo postcards, which they allowed. I was doing research on the encrusted Catholic devotional grottos and vernacular environments in the upper Midwest. So then, over the years, I've been teaching and writing and researching, and there's hardly anything that I've worked on where I haven't been able to spice something up, give it character, give it a sense of place and time with a Teich postcard. So this is just an example of showing a number of sites throughout Wisconsin. Just as an example of recently, Sunday I gave a talk on the folk art genre called tramp art in Santa Fe. It's just an example of being able to find images in this tremendous, seemingly limitless trove of images to illustrate just about anything. In this case, geographical locations, wrapped in little examples of tramp art. But when asked to participate in this panel, I thought talking about how I use these things in my work is not that interesting. So, here's one other example, and the postcard actually shows up. But I thought, and there's one more example of being able to show where the location is in the collection I was talking about. So I thought this is a really good opportunity to look in a 4-drawer postcard file tucked in the archive of the Roger Brown Study Collection and finally look through it. And I guess this is the time where conservators and curators are probably questioning my character, or my qualities as a curator in showing this box that isn't exactly archivally cared for. We have lots and lots of postcards throughout the archive of the Roger Brown Study Collection in folders and document cases of personal and professional correspondence and invitations to art exhibitions and so forth. But this is a case of postcards that Roger Brown collected and that have just never have been cataloged. So I thought I would ask a graduate assistant to look through and first to look at the Curt Teich website, or the Newberry Library website, and understand the Curt Teich postcard phenomenon, and then look through this collection and come up with, or pull out Curt Teich postcards for me, which she did. And it was actually astonishing. Actually, after she pulled out about 30 or 40, I thought, I have 10 minutes. Okay, stop. I'll just use what you found. And the discovery of all manner of things, but particularly a visual vocabulary and design vocabulary that are found in a variety of postcards have such a wonderful correlation or relationship to Roger Brown's own aesthetic or things that he would be interested in. So just this little exercise has opened up a wonderful avenue of research that I can't wait to actually work on. So that's Roger Brown on the left. The Roger Brown Study Collection is a house museum, special collection, archive, and image lab of the School of the Art Institute of Chicago in Brown's former home on Halsted Street, just south of Armitage. And we preserve his collection of art and objects on the second floor and in 2 stairways as a house museum, the way he left it. And then we have an extensive archive, since this guy didn't throw anything away, as it seems. So if you're named Roger Brown, of course, if you find brownies wishing well, that's interesting. And one of the first cards that Catherine Lamandola found, my assistant, is this outline of a vision, and I was just astounded. I could talk for 3 hours about the relationship between this card and Roger Brown, and I can't, so I won't. But the Brown, from the very beginning of his entry into his mature phase of his work in about 1968, Brown was born in 1941, grew up in Alabama, moved to Chicago to study at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and starting in the early 1960s. And for a 27-year career, there are thousands and thousands of silhouetted images in hundreds and hundreds of paintings. And so that outline of a vision, which is just a perfect thing that he would collect. And here are just a few examples of the many paintings in which he used the silhouette really to, I think, stand in for the human endeavor on Earth, in this case in Chicago, in paintings called, on the top, Chicago Taking a Beating on the upper left in the Union League of Chicago Club. The image underneath it is the entry of Christ into Chicago in 1976 in the Whitney Museum's collection, and An Unusual Storm in a private collection. So I think this is the third card that I looked at that Kat pulled, and all of a sudden I had a jolt of recognition. This is one of the tunnels on the Pennsylvania Turnpike. As a kid, I was brought summer after summer from New Jersey to Illinois and then to Iowa to visit grandparents, and we went through all 7 of those tunnels, and they all have names, which I could recite, or I used to be able to. So then I realized, oh, this is one, maybe he had all of the tunnel postcards, and what you're looking at here on the bottom right, you can see a shadow box, and it's a very early work of art that Brown made probably as a freshman or a sophomore in the assignments that were to make something in the manner of another artist. So this is probably in the manner of Joseph Cornell. But on the upper left, you can see it's a three-dimensional collage. And years ago, a graduate student did a complete analysis connecting all of the images to particular Teich postcards. So all of a sudden I realized, oh yes, Roger Brown was looking at these and using these and incorporating them into his work. Then looking through a number of other cards, it seemed very evident that maybe Brown was not necessarily influenced by particular images, and he may well have been, but very definitely informed by a sensibility. So this wonderful Billy Rose's Aquacade, whatever that is, I can only imagine, with its wonderful, explosion of washing of light at night. And there were so many postcards, views, very similar to this, of the Century of Progress World's Fair with buildings bathed in light. And this is straight out of the Roger Brown playbook, especially in early works from the late 60s and early 70s, where he used this halo of light in order to create a kind of mysterious backdrop to mysterious images of lonely cities and so forth, and also a number of paintings that I couldn't fit in order to fit into my 10 minutes of paintings with light washing up, similar to that. I couldn't help the comparison between this Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania steel company with the incredibly dramatic explosion of molten metal and very, very dramatic colors of showing that industrial process, and just one from a series of paintings that Roger Brown did in a disaster series in 1972 of buildings exploding, which, since we're here on September 11th, is, I can't tell you how many emails and phone calls we received after the explosion of the World Trade Center that people thought this particular image was so prescient. Brown really had his fingers on the pulse of of American history before and after his life. He loved and painted many paintings of buildings as objects. And even though his painting of the Leaning Tower of Tui, it is an actual building, it's also kind of an object. And so it's no surprise that he would have collected the Havoline thermometer from the Century of Progress exhibition. And then there are some non-Teich postcards in his collection that weren't made by the Teich company, but I wonder if he did many, many paintings of the touristic landscapes across the United States, particularly in the West. So maybe he decided to do his painting Sequoia based on the postcard on the left. And then I realized that the relationship between the many of the images in the postcards in his collection relate to actual things that he collected and that are in one of his 3 home collections, all of which he gave to the School of the Art Institute. So I was kind of shocked to come across this because even though, as I mentioned, and I mentioned humbly that we have not organized this little collection yet, I imagine that it was something that kind of he got early on and wasn't added to over the years. It had that feeling about it. And so these are Apache gone dancers, and this is view of Roger Brown's bedroom in his La Conchita, California collection, or home and collection. But he had 2 of these Apache gone dancing headdresses and stick items hanging there. So the fact that he had this card early on and then later actually collected those objects is just a suggestion of another way of researching it through the postcards that he collected. And then another dimension, which both Mike and Catherine touched on, are the social and cultural information that really depict certain points in time in our history in certain ways that things could be talked about. Terror, treachery, cunning are your first thoughts when you witness an Apache devil dance, regardless of whether seen it, et cetera, probably would not be the way these dancers and this ceremony would be talked about, at least by some today. But the dimension and the depth of these postcards includes the information that's printed on the back, and so they become a really wonderful treasure trove of that avenue of research. Then we do have a few postcards in the collection proper. These are 2 cards that are incredibly poignant, written by Roger Brown to his partner George, who he was probably missing while he was in Florida. Hi, just going out for steamed shrimp. Hi, ate dinner at a marvelous Italian, I think, restaurant. Italian-style meal, bought many nice things. Of course, it's Roger Brown. Tomorrow, I'm going over to try Sinbad tent for seafood. Love, Roger. So I welcome you all, but not all at the same time, to visit the Roger Brown Study Collection. And just in closing, this wonderful advertisement, we cordially invite you to Elko, where lots of fun awaits you for your weekend short trip or your planned vacation. If any of your immediate acquaintances wish to get married, our Ramona room is ready. We make all arrangements. Thank you.
Well, those were amazing presentations. Thank you all, really, and I'm loving the different angles that you're coming in at in order to illuminate postcards in the various ways that we can use them, be inspired by them, create with them, learn from them. I will ask a few questions, but I imagine there's probably a lot of questions in the room as well, so I'll open it up to you. I want to start with a question. It's really to all of you, but maybe, Catherine, you can take a stab at it first, about the relationship between postcards and and really high art, or what we might call everyday art or visual culture. I was really struck by that image of Leonard Lauder standing in front of the Picasso, and yet obviously he's a massive collector of postcards. So there's that aspect too, like where do postcards fit in the kind of our thinking about visual imagery, art, you know, how are they kind of part of that conversation about art? And then also too, the fact that, you know, Catherine, you've said this before, so many designers in Chicago who came out of art schools then worked for the Teich Postcard company, right? And were part of that's where they had their jobs, right? And so they were sort of both part of a commercial world as well as very much the larger creative world of Chicago and design.
Yeah, that's two sort of separate things there, but I'll take a stab at both of them. I think the simpler one is just how the Teich company figured in as an employer of people coming out of the design schools like the Ray Vogue School and some other schools in Chicago, wanting to be, whatever their reasons for going into the design world when they started, but whether they wanted to be a fine artist or not, ended up doing some form of commercial art. And the Teich company did employ a whole art department. Probably the best example is the large letter postcards. The way those were made is that the client, so let's say Pulaski, Wisconsin, is a client, and maybe whoever in Pulaski, Wisconsin, the Five and Dime, is going to order a large letter postcard that'll say, "Greetings from Pulaski, Wisconsin." So the client has to send to the Teich company photographs, 8.5 by or 8 by 10 photographs for each of those letters. So whatever it is in the community, the Carnegie Library, the gazebo, the church, whatever it is in the community that the client wants in those letters, they have to send a big postcard a photograph of it. And then the art department reduces those photographically, cuts them out to fit in Pulaski in each of the letters, and then hand draws all of the imagery around it. So the one I had was Puxatawny, PA. And all of that, the groundhog and all of the sort of star-shaped stuff that Roger Brown would have loved. I don't know if he had that one, but he would have loved that one. That was all hand-drawn by the art department. And if you also go to the Sioux Falls, South Dakota, the Kirk's Cafe, Kirk's Better Food, not only the postcard sketch that would have been sent to the client for approval on color, but also all of the airbrushing right on the photographic print to remove the farmer at the door and to take the cloth off the ground and to whatever it is you're going to do, take the automobile out of the view. Whatever was taken in or added, all of that had to be done in the art department. There's some really terrific pictures that I'm sure are in the collection that shows the art department, and over each of the drawing tables there's an airbrush hose that goes down, so each one of them had airbrush right at their table, and it was quite an employer of graphic design. And then quickly on the other thing, because they're really kind of two sorts of, or do you want me to?
No, that's right. I think both questions sort of underscoring the kind of visual expertise that goes behind the card making, though, too, right?
Yes, I think that especially with the linen postcards, people aren't aware that those are photographs, just like Kirk's Better Food is a good example of it. It doesn't look like a photograph. It's at the basis of that image as the consumer buys it and sends it and purchases and sends it. But there is, and it had to be designed by somebody. So there is a very strong graphic sensibility that went into the whole production of that. And then as to the comment about Leonard Lauder, he is quoted many times as saying that his Picasso or his Braque or his Leger or whatever Cubist artist painting that's worth millions and millions of dollars, he thinks of that not in terms of its value at all and loves them no more nor less than his postcards. And he sees both of them as expressive of the world of the 20th century in equal measure. And he has said that postcards are the most enduring visual form of communication in terms of how they're used in the 20th century. So I think that that's important. But as to fine art, I think you're a better place to comment on that.
Well, a couple of things. There are many, many contemporary artists and modern artists who use postcards in their work or use them to begin with. And one great example is the artist Zoe Leonard, who several years ago I saw an exhibition of her, a piece at Dia Beacon, this huge museum, museum of conceptual art, and she had, I believe it's over 5,000, I'm not good with numbers, but it was an enormous, huge, long installation, all of postcards, and I think they're all Teich or Teich-like, of Niagara Falls. And so you follow this thing. I looked at every one, I think. But, so that was a visual piece that had conceptual basis, and I could probably, with a little more advance notice, and think about lots of other artists who use postcards in their work or incorporate it into other mediums. But then I think at the core of your question is something that's so important in contemporary thinking, and especially in contemporary art, is dissolving the boundaries between high and low and folk and fine and kitsch and whatever. And as everyone has discussed, that this is a medium that respects, honors, and acknowledges the vernacular. Everyday life is important, and Roger Brown spent his life trying to get that across in his work and in his life and in his collecting. And so postcards do it.
That's a great way of thinking that through. In terms of the postcard also as a medium of communication, of one person writing a note and the human aspect of it then reaching another person with their experience, with the place behind it. That was really well put, I think, by all of you. And I wanted to think through also, Mike, maybe you can answer this question about the United States Post Office. Like how, you kind of make the point that real life postcards are kind of proto-Instagram in their immediacy, communicating with an image. But then I think, well, but Instagram is really immediate. So maybe you could say a little bit more.
Most of you today saw pictures of the images. We didn't deal with content, and quite frankly, a lot of the content on the cards is pretty minimal, But one particular one to me in my collection that I'm still amazed by is we used to have 2 mail deliveries a day, and I had a postcard that someone had received that said, "I'll be home at 4 in the afternoon today." So in the morning, it was so reliable that they could write a message and send it home instead of calling, because the postman would get it there. That's Instagram. I mean, that's about as close as you can get using the United States Postal Service to tell that story that quickly. And there's probably other stories to come from the stories on them, but on the whole, in the world of the postcard marketing, oftentimes people don't even show the story that's on there because it's just a minimal kind of, we were here, and that's unfortunate. But.
I wanted to ask another question, and I know there's other questions in the room too, so then I'll open it up, but it's about nostalgia and what we do with postcards now. People still send postcards. I send postcards. My mother sends me postcards all the time. But there is kind of a throwback element to the postcard now, too, given our newer forms of immediate communication. And so I wanted to think about, and I love the Roger Brown showing how he used postcards is so fantastic, because there's this element of nostalgia in his work itself, too, that's so interesting to think about in terms of how we now also experience the postcard, look at postcards, and think about the past. But it's really a question about what we do with that nostalgia, or what we do with postcards now, right?
Well, one of the things I wonder about is, will the postcard happen and its revival like vinyl records? Yeah. I mean, vinyl was over, it was done, and all of a sudden, it's the cult news side of the media in terms of music. So could this happen with postcards as well? You know, that all of a sudden it has a sort of a renaissance as a retro technology.
Right, right,
And it's not outside the realm of possibility.
right.
Well, I had a comment about that when I first, I mean, I've always loved postcards, but when I first came into it professionally, for a while, I sort of dipped my research end of the work I was doing in the realm of ephemera. But I came to think of postcards differently, that they're not ephemeral in the same way that, say, cocktail napkins might be, or the little spears in a club sandwich might be, and the other things that are really not intended to be saved. People may save them, but they're not intended to be saved. And I do think that there's a strongly emotional connection sometimes to postcards about your own self and your own life, or about the lives of people who are past. And since you asked that question, amazingly, just yesterday I was looking through some books, and this book belonged to my father, and it has all of his notes from the book, but in the front of it are postcards. My father was one of the ministers at Fourth Presbyterian Church across from the Hancock Tower after the Second World War, the man that you saw in the Second World War. And here in the front of this book are 3 Curt Teich postcards of Fourth Presbyterian Church from 1947, so that would have been when he was a minister, and another view, a Hedrick Blessing view of the Palmolive building, showing the turn right where the Drake is, and then some other things. But when I found those, I just, like all of you, the emotion kind of overtakes you, because you know exactly what it meant to this exact human in all the millions and millions of humans who exist here. So whether or not it's Roger Brown who is inspired by that imagery, or whether it's just your father who's gone, but you know that that meant something to him, he saved those. They weren't ephemeral to him. And I do think that's part of the power of postcards too, that those, I immediately knew everything I needed to know just by touching these postcards.
And it's kind of why I touched upon my sadness at the lost ancestors, you know, that whole genre of unknown postcards where somebody got their image done, but nobody put the information down, and then it was lost to society and humanity. So maybe someday artificial intelligence and face recognition will get so good, we'll have this international archive of old postcards, and you can start to find your ancestors. What do you think, huh? Can we put these two together, old media and new technology?
Maybe.
Somehow.
Yeah.
Well, just touching on Catherine's really poignant story, and we could argue about what's ephemeral and what's not, because a lot of people save everything, but postcards in particular, I think have the power to be a kind of trigger to memory, no matter if it's a close family person or something else that you find. So they can function as kind of time capsules, and so maybe it's not always nostalgia, which would be sort of longing for a previous time, but just bringing that time into your own time. They're connectors for me, and I do save those little cocktail stir sticks in the
I know you do.
those sandwich things.
There's a support group for that. It's okay.
All right, well, let's open it up to some comments or questions from the audience.
Now, if you'll just wait for the microphone, I'll bring it to you.
Yeah, this is wonderful. You should do it every month. So I have a question from Mike and Catherine. I always wondered, I was wondering what your feeling was about what Curt Teich did to images. So they were known for whatever you wanted. If you didn't like that telegraph wire in the picture, you didn't want a car, you didn't want the janitor, they would do that as part of their business, or you could pick out what clouds you wanted in the sky. So now we're talking about images that may or may not be reflecting of what was actually there.
I guess that's one of the reasons why I like the real photo postcards so much, because they aren't as edited. They are the more direct, this is what you see, this captured this moment in time. So I think from an historian, they have the greatest value to the future because all that information is on there. But that doesn't mean that the Curt Teich image isn't got another part of that story, but it's got an edited story.
That's why the production files are so rich too, is because you can see historically what was demanded to be left out.
You can also consider it composed. They're composed images, and they're, Catherine should probably be answering this, but they are made for a client who wants to show a particular vibe or a particular, they want business to their downtown, or they want business to that the better restaurant, better cafe. So I think the contemporary version of that is all manner of photoshopping that happens, everywhere. Well, this could be a 3-hour discussion that would go into ethics and so forth. But Catherine?
Well, yeah, I think that's the perfect way to put it, is that they're composed, and that so that you can understand both the more straightforward image, the more documentary recorded image, but it's just as important in trying to understand the culture of any time to understand the intellectual intention behind the composition. So both have a place, it's just not exactly the same place. And maybe that's one of the important aspects of the Teich Archives collection, in that it's the largest comprehensive public collection of this genre of visual information in the world. And it has this breadth of representation that is really amazing, that it was put together, that the idea came about. But I think that saying that it's composed is exactly right, that there's an intellectual intention behind it, and both have a place.
Thank you, guys.
I'm curious that in 1978, when the company closed, how did this collection, how did it not wind up in an alley, behind Ravenswood or something, being carted away? That's amazing to me. Did somebody, bequeath it, or, but that it exists is amazing.
Yeah, it's really, Ralph Teich, who's the youngest son of Curt Teich, is entirely 100% credited for everything that we have here at the Newberry Library tonight, even though other people took it over and curated it and took care of it. But much of it was carted away, and unfortunately what was carted away were the glass plate negatives for the early views. So the 100,000 art files that we have, those are all, almost none of them, very few, maybe 3 or something, have a glass plate negative. But Curt Teich Jr., who was the eldest son in that next generation, was very secretive just generally, and very suspicious, and he had kind of a suspicious business nature about him. And when it became apparent, for a number of reasons that there isn't time to tell about tonight, that the business was going to close, he began to systematically throw stuff out. And it was Ralph Teich who tried to stop him from doing that, which he semi-successfully did. I've often thought that you could figure out from whatever removal service they hired in the early 1970s behind that Ravenswood, plant, you could probably figure out what landfill they're in and go searching for them. But it's not worth it. I've thought about it, it's not worth it.
Catherine, is the story in that book?
Yeah, I'll mention that in a minute, but just a brief thing about the Teich company. Curt Sr., in his, I've been told, I'm not German, but in his German way, systematically kept 15 examples of every postcard he printed. They don't all exist, but mostly, by and large, they all exist. And did that from the time he went into business from till 1978 when he went out of business. And so the bones of the collection was there, this industrial archive that recorded pictures of every state in the United States, every province of Canada, and other foreign countries from about 1910 to 1978. It's just remarkable that their stock in trade wasn't cocktail napkins, but their stock in trade was to record images of the world. And then he had the foresight to systematically preserve it.
One thing that is absent from the archives are their business papers.
Yes.
So there's no, and
very little.
What you said about Curt systematically removing things makes me wonder if, as the business was declining, if there was some reason or other that he was ditching the business files, because all we have in terms of the client correspondence are on those, is on those labels on the job files. And yet any type of correspondence, and sometimes there are references to really serious complaints, I mean, things that were sent back because they didn't reflect the instructions they had been given. And, you know, we have so many questions about the distribution. I mean, it's touched on a little bit, but there's so many unanswered questions relating to their business practices and their subcontractors for distributors that's really gone. But what we have, we cherish and we're happy for.
Yeah, I don't know, that's lost with the fish stories as to why that doesn't exist. But I do think it has to do with, all of the Teichs were pretty suspicious of stealing trade secrets, and so probably they just kept it. That's right, the printing methods are not well described.
Maybe one more quick question.
Looking at the Kirk's postcard, I was curious if postcards were ever used as a marketing tool by local businesses or like big corporations. Like, was there any influence?
To advertise, you mean? Oh, very much so. I didn't show it, you know, in my, sometimes I speak at longer length and show lots of examples of advertising postcards. Wonderful.
Great images.
You know, advertising everything from, I don't know, toasters to anything. It's
Embalming fluid.
embalming fluid. There's a really great embalming fluid. Well,
That's right.
In fact, in the Teich
There is
collection,
indeed, yeah.
there is a whole category of mostly advertising related to funerary practices, just funeral homes, casket companies, burial clothing, you know, how do you want to look when you're
And local stores, I mean, if you want to track styles, there are local men's stores, local women's stores, shoes. We once did we're sort of focusing on shoes one day, and we couldn't believe we tracked all the Red Cross shoes during World War II for women that, you know, were patriotic to buy. And there's one gentleman who was in the audience earlier who was a member of the project team that was sorting Holiday Inn postcards, for example. And we decided that we must have the best representation in the world of all the Holiday Inns that ever existed at every era of the 20th century.
You do, because Ralph Teich, that was his baby, Holiday
Really?
Inn.
Oh.
Absolutely. That was his account. No one else touched Holiday Inns, and he
did a good job.
He did a good job. We have all of them.
Thank you all again so much. Thank you for being here.